Why does this anti-democratic tyrant need elections? It's because he's locked into them as a weird legitimation ritual for his perceived legitimacy. Behind the scenes, his team has been working furiously to deliver a fake impression of near unanimous popularity and love.
Polling day in the Soviet Union.
Many tyrannies have elections, including the Soviet Union.
Each district has only one candidate.
But Putin's elections reveal a special truth about his regime. Putin is the only institution in Russia with perceived legitimacy, and his perceived legitimacy rests on an invocation of a magical idea of the people. Putin is the only politician in Russia. All other institutions are just mechanisms to implement his will, which is supposedly an expression of the will of the Russian people. Russia! But who are the people according to this magical concept? It's not all Russians. It's rather the population conceived in a somewhat mystical way as a body with a will of its own. This is an ideological construct because its function is to make Putin all-powerful in the name of the sovereignty of the people. And we know, don't we, how badly this invocation of the people can end from European history. Just think of the Great Terror of 1793-94. This weirdly makes the idea of opposing Putin not just a practical but a theoretical impossibility, because if you oppose him, you are misrepresenting the will of the people, and therefore, by definition, you must be some kind of Washington-ordained, malign foreign interferer in Russia's real politics. So the ritual of the election is to show that Putin is legitimate because he has this magical direct access to the Russian people. So that's how his election works as an exercise to generate perceived legitimacy. And this is really well illustrated by how Putin got asked to run for president. Putin's announcement that he was running was instigated by Lieutenant Colonel Artyom Zhoga, who is the illegitimate chairman of the People's Council of the Donetsk People's Republic. Zhoga said to Putin, "We need you, Mr. President. Please run." Putin said, "I will run." And then Zhoga, after this interaction, said, "What Putin's just said means that today our president is with the people." What Putin is doing through this ritual is putting on a show which tells his inner circle, the people are with me, which tells the depoliticized majority of the Russian population, the people are with me, and which tells his opponents that they're either alone or crazy because the people are with me, and which tells the West, the people are with me, and all opposition to me are merely freaks corrupted by the West. Now let's look at why it's important for Putin to tell his inner circle, the people are with me. Putin's power was eroding before he started the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Although Western commentators often view Putin as all-powerful, in reality he presides over a kind of blend between a board of a corporation and a mafia organization, in which the members have definite measures of importance, but often fluid roles. Putin outsources to these people his presidential powers, which might well be illegal actually. Then they engage in conflict about what to do with these powers, and then Putin comes in and arbitrates these conflicts. Before the war, Putin's dealings with these conflicts increasingly put him in a kind of referee rather than a leadership role. And that is one of the several reasons why he started the damn war to begin with. He wanted to reconcentrate power back in his own hands. This process is going a bit more smoothly for him now, but in the first year and a half of the war, it got out of hand when a normal conflict between the Ministry of Defense and Prigozhin got out of hand. And the same model of conflict within Putin's court settled the fate of the quasi-oppositional candidate who tried to run for president Boris Nadezhdin. Nadezhdin has deep connections with the regime, but he was also critical of the war from the beginning. Why was Nadezhdin allowed to run? He was allowed to run because the Kremlin needs fake oppositional candidates who play by its rules. And in Nadezhdin, it saw a possibility to divide the real Russian opposition. They expected that Navalny's camp would say, we're not going to get our hands dirty with Mr. Nadezhdin, but that the rest of the Russian opposition would say, let's back Nadezhdin and see what happens. But the liberal opposition unified, and queues appeared all over the country, which were to a large extent, in effect, just queues for Mr. Navalny. If Mr. Nadezhdin had gone native and radicalized, he could have created the regime's second legitimacy crisis since the Prigozhin mutiny.
We collect signatures in 300 cities of 42 states all over the world.
But having been launched by the regime, Nadezhdin was removed from the field, and that expressed a conflict within the regime about how to secure Mr. Putin's legitimacy. One hardline camp, say the Patrushev camp, said, let's be tough and let's have an electoral ritual without thrills. Another camp, say the Mr. Kiriyenko camp, said, let's have some thrills and use them as a way to tie liberal-leaning citizens with a candidate who is palpably made to look ridiculous and unpopular. With Nadezhdin out, 3 candidates were left to run against Putin. There is Vladislav Davenkov, who represents a party created by Mr. Kiriyenko to give vaguely liberal-minded Russians something to vote for. So the party is a Kremlin scheme to capture the dissatisfied vote. Mr. Davenkov is quote-unquote against the war. He's in favor of ending the war on terms favorable to Russia. Then there is Nikolai Kharitonov, who represents the Communist Party, and it's a testament to the post-truth degeneration of Russian politics that Russia's Communist Party is in fact a hard-right political party that services Putin. Meanwhile, Boris Kagarlitsky, a legitimate left-wing intellectual, is in jail. Then there is Leonid Slutsky, the most unsavory candidate, who is the infinitely less charismatic successor to Vladimir Zhirinovsky as head of Russia's Liberal Democratic Party. That is an Orwellian name, because the historical function of that party has been to act as a reservation for the most hardcore ultranationalist nutcases so that the Kremlin could control them. Let's now look at the strategy of the Russian opposition. By killing Alexei Navalny, Putin eliminated the main politicizing voice among Russia's liberal opposition. That may well backfire for Putin in the long term, but not now. The last political edict Alexei Navalny gave was in support of an action called Midday Against Putin. The idea was to queue up at voting stations at 12 p.m. on the 17th of March, whether you're voting or not. This became the first part of a two-pronged strategy used by the Russian opposition. The aim here was unaloneness, to create an interruption in the regime's ceaseless determination to obliterate any semblance of cooperation between citizens for political ends. The second part of the strategy was how to vote, and here the Russian opposition quarreled. Max Katz said vote for Davenkov as the least odious and the least pro-war candidate. Navalny's team rejected this proposal and they said vote for any of the other three or just spoil the ballot. Mr. Khodorkovsky's team called for unity, pointing out that there is no conflict between the Navalny camp and the Katz camp, so for goodness sake, stop arguing. But how much of the Russian population actually supports Russia's liberal opposition, and how much would if the elections were democratic? I'm going to say something that will be wrong if you listen carelessly, but will be right if you listen carefully. The number of Russian citizens who support substantively the Russian opposition may be higher than the number of people who substantively support Putin. Let's break this down. From what we know, liberal democratically oppositional Russians range from conservatively 10% to generously 25% of the population. These people disproportionately include the younger generation. And one more reason why Putin started the war was to quash the preference for change that developed among the younger generation. Here I want to add a caveat when we think about this up to 25% of the oppositional Russian population. We know that you cannot compel belief, no matter how bad of a tyrant you are. But nevertheless, when people go on for a long time not being able to say what they think, there is a risk that they're going to gradually begin to stop thinking it, that their thoughts are going to retreat into the subconscious until a possibility for action arises, and then these thoughts come back out. Then there is the depoliticized blob in the middle, which regular viewers of my channels know very well about. These are people who have no substantive beliefs about politics. They do not have thoughts like the war is bad for reasons X, Y, Z, or the war is good for reasons X, Y, Z. So what do they have? They have inferential beliefs. So here is an example. I don't know why Putin started the war, but it would be good if Putin had good reasons to end the war, which I don't know about, and acted on them. But then again, it may be that he has no such reasons, and that just shows that politics is hard, and I've got to look away. It's really hard to figure out what this depoliticized blob is all about via polls. But some polling projects do a reasonable job. For instance, Russian Field often do polls where the second question is, would you like it if Putin continued the war? And the 17th question is, would you like it if Putin stopped the war today? And very often what you get are big majorities saying yes to both. Now, much of this depoliticized blob votes Putin, but we can't call them Putin's supporters in the conventional sense of the term, because they neither support nor oppose particular policies of Putin's, and nor do they vote for political reasons. They largely vote for perfunctory reasons, a little bit of coercion at work, a feeling that there's a compulsory social ritual you've got to jump through the hoops of, and so on. And now we come to the pro-Kremlin group that ranges from the very low double digits to perhaps up to 20% of the Russian population. These people are substantively pro-war, substantively pro-Putin, and in fact are sometimes oppositional. They think the Putin regime is not prosecuting the war effectively or aggressively enough. The Putin regime is in a bind with these people, and we've seen from the imprisonment of Girkin and the elimination of Prigozhin the absurd truth that this isn't just a regime that doesn't obviously have supporters, it's a regime that's terrified of having supporters. But this may change as the regime over time moves to become a genuine leader for these hardline radicals. Putin has run into a paradox. He needs to mobilize the population for a war, perhaps a bigger war than the brutal invasion of Ukraine, and yet he knows that his regime's stability is dependent on the population remaining depoliticized. He needs people at the front, and he needs them on the couch. Slowly, the regime will move toward politicization via the militarization of the economy, of the education system, and of society. And as it goes on that path, it'll run into new instability. After about a year and a half of wobbles during Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, sadly, in 2024, Putin's regime has stabilized. But this won't last, because the regime sees itself as inevitably locked in to a pattern of totalitarian turns at home and further escalations abroad. And in the process of engaging in this, the regime will need to redefine itself and potentially redefine how it understands its own legitimacy. And here a question arises. Will Putin coronate himself as unelected Tsar? Political philosopher Greg Yudin points out that Putin is already a Tsar of sorts in the tradition of elective monarchy, exemplified perhaps by Napoleon III in 19th century France. But giving up on electoral ritual would reconfigure the way the Putin regime's perceived legitimacy works. And you know that I say perceived legitimacy because the Putin regime is illegitimate. But having said this, could this happen? Could he coronate himself as Tsar? Not soon, but I actually think it's possible, which is an indication of what a bizarre polity Russia is. If this happened, it would be an expression of Putin's obsessive relationships with past Russian Tsars, perhaps the leading of which is his relationship with Tsar Alexander III. And to understand that more, watch this video next.